My name is Leora Wolf-Prusan, she, hers, and I'm the project director for the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. I'm so grateful that you're joining us on January 14th for this conversation. So welcome, happy to have you here. All of our recordings and this deck is going to be up on our foundational modules website. We're going to get started because we have so much to sit with and to hold and to reflect and chew on today. So many folks from across the country joining us. I saw, let's see, I saw California, I saw DC, I saw Ohio, I saw New Mexico, New Jersey, welcome, welcome, and Arizona. So glad to see you. Okay. So if you're here because you are hoping to sit with the conversation around school crisis recovery and renewal, leadership, the art of apology and repair. And you may be familiar with us at the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. You might be new to us, whoever you are and wherever you are, we're glad to have you. Welcome. Okay. So our project is funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and we are a part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN, which many of you are familiar with. And we're so grateful that the 20-plus-year-old network has just been an incredible thought leader in the world of child trauma. And so we're grateful to be a new project in the network. And all of the thoughts and opinions of both us as a project and our guest faculty today are of their views and their views only. Okay. Yeah, I'm so excited. This is like a personal dream 90-minute session. So I'm so excited to be introducing today. So again, if we haven't met, my name is Leora, she, hers. I'm the project director for SCRR, the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. I'm going to get a little bit more into who we are in a second. And then what will happen today, I'm going to go through this in our agenda in a second, is that we have a kind of a bunch of almost like a beaded necklace of thought leaders in terms of school crisis leadership and the art of recovery and repair. So Darrick will offer his teachings, Claudia and Mark are going to offer their teachings, Rob will offer their teachings, and they'll introduce themselves and what brings them to the conversation. What is so vibrant and brilliant about today, and what I'm so personally excited about, is that all the offerings come from educators with lived educator school crisis experience, ranging from principals to school psychologists to curriculum specialists. And I'm looking in the chat box, and I know that many of you carry multiple roles, and you have carried multiple roles in your career as well. So we're looking forward to the conversation. Okay, so what might today feel like? As I mentioned, I'm going to offer an introduction to our project and to today. We're going to do a little bit of a quick rewind and recap into school crisis recovery and renewal. I can see some familiar faces who were on with us during those two modules in November and December. And if you missed those, they are up. The recordings are up on our website. We're going to just do a little quick recap to frame why we're having this particular conversation now. And then we'll get to hear from Darrick. Then we'll get to hear from Claudia and Mark. And then we'll get to hear from Rob. We really hope in the chat box that y'all light up the chat with what you agree with, what you argue with, what you aspire to, wonderings and curiosities. And then we'll tie it all together. Like, what themes do we hear from all three offerings? What similarities and what differences? And what does this bring up? We know that here at SCRR, we try to really evoke the spirit of reflection and inquiry, which are two practices of authentic leadership always, and especially during, before, and after a crisis. So welcome again. If you have not yet, please do put your name and your role and your location in the chat box. And please make sure that any of what you contribute is to panelists and attendees so that we can all learn from each other. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna offer us, this is completely invitational, of course. One of the beauties of Zoom webinar is that we can't see you. And so you have full safety to be and land in your own learning from wherever you were just coming and whatever is coming up. after this 90 minutes together, that you have your own invitation, your own opportunity to land and to kind of use this moment in whatever way you need to transition to be present and to be here. So I'm going to offer one way. And one way that I'm going to offer us is to, if you can, and if it's available to you, to find both feet on the floor, and to find your hands either palms up if you're kind of looking for more energy, if you're feeling like you're a little bit sleepy or a little bit tired, or palms down if you're feeling a little bit hyper or a little bit over caffeinated, which you might be hearing I am because I'm excited and I had 2 cups of coffee. And I'm going to invite you to take whatever kind of breath you need, fast or slow, and then just find one green thing in your visual periphery. One green thing. It might be on my screen. It might be in front of you. Just to locate one green thing and then rest your eyes upon it, just for a couple quiet moments. Okay. I'm going to invite you in the chat box, and this is also a way that we can get to know each other, in the chat box to offer, what was the green thing that you saw in your space? In the chat box, what was the green thing? What are you seeing around you that is alive? Oh, a memo pad. Okay, so maybe not alive, but definitely green, yes. A body of a butterfly hanging, leaves, my plant, a green tree, the hedge outside my window, a box of tissues, wallet, a stuffed green frog. I almost read that as a green frog, and then I was very impressed. Yes, trees blowing in the wind outside. Wonderful. Thank you. So as we're talking about conversation points that can often evoke a sense of openness or heaviness, or potentially sometimes an activation of a memory of a past moment of harm, it's an invitation that you have things in your space to remind you of life and to remind you of vibrancy. Okay, thank you for offering all your plants. So in that note, we're going to take a couple seconds to just ground us in who this project is and why we're all together. So again, welcome if you are new to SCRR and if you're new to this project. I'm so grateful that we are able to be part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And we are a project, we're just in our first 5 months, y'all, our first 5 months. And it has felt like a 5 months. To create a national dialogue, national work to support educator and student-driven long-term crisis recovery and renewal work. So national standards, national content, national training, national learning experiences that help us as school communities think and rethink about what is a big thing that happened and how and why can we make meaning of it in the years after. And so we say that school crisis readiness is essential, and there are folks on this panel today that are a big part of the readiness, and that the response is critical and a big part of response, but what happens after matters too. What happens after matters too. We're grateful to be a partnership of the Center for Applied Research Solutions and Trauma Transform. Many of you are fans of Trauma Transform, and as I said earlier, a partner of the NCTSN. So and I'm going to ask Livia to drop the link in the chat. Our guidepost document is the school crisis leadership lessons, and we really rely on your voices that many of your colleagues contributed to in their reflection of what school crisis readiness, response, recovery, and renewal leadership feels like and looks like and sounds like. I was mentioning to some of the panelists earlier that I have my doctorate in educational leadership. And not once in any of my training do we ever talk about crisis, or do we ever talk about what would happen if there was harm in the community. We talked a lot about administration and we talked a lot about management, but there was a big gap in the real life. And so a lot of the learning happens on the ground. And so that's part of what we want to lift up today so that we can all support each other in our learnings and in our reflections. Okay. The framework around school crisis recovery and renewal rests in this idea that we can get ready, which is before, we can respond, which is during, that recovery is that phase during the week or the month or the year after a big thing. And it usually focuses both on the past, but also in the real time, in the present. And that this concept of renewal is really a year or more after a big thing happens. And again, I'm using the word big thing happens because it's really up to you and your communities, your students and your families to define if something feels like a crisis or not, right? It's not up to the dominant culture to define who gets attention. It's up to us as communities to define that for ourselves. And renewal is focused on the present and the future. So while our project concentrates mostly on recovery and renewal, we know that nothing is clean, nothing is nice kind of stacked stages, that everything is very messy and interactive and mutually informing. And we also know, especially in this moment, that many of us, if not all of us, are constantly responding as we're trying to recover, as we're also trying to step into the work of renewal, and then of course get ready. So this leadership work is quite complex. Let's talk about what that means for us in our leadership work. Let's talk about what that means. All right, so David Whyte, the poet David Whyte says, crisis is essentially about vulnerability, which is an experience in which we are open to the world in a different way, whether we want to be or not. I'm going to read that one more time. Crisis is essentially about vulnerability, which is an experience in which we are open to the world in a different way, whether we want to be or not. Today, as we're talking about the art of apology and repair, and we use the word art really intentionally because art is dynamic. It's not fixed. It's, like we said earlier, kind of messy and open and personal and collective. That this work around recovery and repair and atonement and apology often deeply requires and involves vulnerability. So I'm going to invite you in the chat box, and please do make sure, and I'm going to invite the panelists as well, please do make sure that in your chat box, the dropdown is to panelists and attendees to just offer what's coming up for you or the connections you're making with what David Whyte offers us and this concept of apology and repair. What comes up for you? What connections might we make? What comes up? So I'll read it one more time. Crisis is essentially about vulnerability, which is an experience in which we are open to the world in a different way, whether we want to be or not. So knowing that we're talking about the art of apology and repair in the context of school crisis, how might we connect what David is offering us? Okay, so whether we want to be or not is standing out right now, especially in the pandemic. Yep, so we're getting a lot of pandemic connections. We're getting some like, thank you for this, describing the word crisis. That sometimes we are faced with the things we don't want to be, but we don't have a choice but to face them. So sometimes the work of school crisis leadership is where we are suddenly, where it might feel like something is happening to us rather than with us, and then we have to navigate the dissonance between those two experiences. Yep, we're getting being opened in a different way, the possibilities, and that healing happens in the vulnerable place when we can let our guard down and be really present with one another. Thank you for that. These are beautiful. I'm going to read a couple more. So ready to be open to possibilities. Yes. And we as a society seem to not be comfortable with being vulnerable, making an apology, and embracing humility. Yeah. And I would be remiss to not acknowledge that we are at a time collectively of both asking people to atone and to acknowledge and to apologize and repair, and also deeply needing it for ourselves as individuals and in the collective. And there have been many moments in our collective consciousness and our collective experience, especially in this last year and this last week, where these skills, but more so the need, has surfaced so strongly. Okay, one more or two more. A lot of how we authentically apologize when we are new to being vulnerable. Beautiful. And vulnerability is scary. It includes being open and honest, and it asks of ourselves and others. Thank you. Yep. So for many of us as school leaders, we're very much trained to need to know the answer. And I'm thinking specifically of all of you who've been administrators during the pandemic and right now, where you're being turned to have answers and to have direction in a time where there are no easy answers and there are no easy directions. And so that role, again, as mitigating, as sitting in the tension, is so real for us. Okay. So I'm shifting right now quickly to this definition of school mental health crisis leadership. So we at SCRR, this comes from the guide that we mentioned earlier. We at SCRR define school mental health crisis leadership. And I'm going to read it out loud and invite you just to notice when you go like, ooh, like when there's a moment where you're like, oh, that language just resonates or evokes. That school mental health crisis is the individual, collective, and organizational and systemic skills, knowledge, and competencies to create school conditions, climates, and cultures that empower others to navigate uncertainty and harm. This leadership is based on awareness and acceptance of the responsibility and accountability to help all students, staff, and partners repair, reconnect, regulate, and restore. So today's conversation helps us take this definition of school mental health crisis leadership, which we adapted from Marshall Gantt's community organizing, and apply it specifically to this act of accountability and repair. Yeah, culture that empowers. Okay, really, so let's just take a couple seconds to do one more connection with what does all of this have to do with trauma-informed and healing-centered practices, specifically leadership. Okay, so many of us can rattle off the trauma-informed principles on one hand or two hands, or however we define trauma-informed principles or how we have contextualized what SAMS has offered us. There's two specific trauma-informed principles that require us and ask us to sit in the conversation that we're having today. The first one is about safety, which we have talked about a lot as a community before, and we have way more space. Hopefully Dr. Darrick Smith will do this in the future, way more space to problematize and to contextualize what safety is for whom, by whom in the future. Today, I'm asking us to narrow in on this concept of trustworthiness and also transparency, right? Sometimes they're said in the same breath, trustworthiness and transparency. So the invitation today is to think about how might leading through school crisis complicate and also embolden us to get stronger in our trustworthiness with ourselves, with those that we collaborate with, and those that we serve. The concepts around transparency and trustworthiness, I mean, in a distilled sense, really helps us understand that trustworthiness and transparency rest on both kind of competence and character at the same time. Competence and character. So as you hear Darrick speak and as you hear Claudia and Mark have a dialogue together and then Rob offer, I'm going to invite us to think about how are we hearing the concept of vulnerability lift up? How are we hearing the definition of school mental health crisis leadership that I just mentioned? Or even what kind of constellation here, benevolence, honesty, opening, reliability, competence, how are we hearing those skills and knowledge and deep and deep ways of being show up in the work? Okay, last couple pieces, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Smith. If you don't know Mia Mingus yet, I very much recommend you knowing Mia Mingus, who is an incredible thought leader, not only in the field of restorative justice, but transformational justice. And Mia Mingus offers us that the art of apology and accountability, specifically when there is harm, and we just want to set the level straight right now, in any school community that is made of people, there will be harm. In any school community that experiences crisis, there will be harm because this leadership is messy. Leading through grief and leading through loss of life and leading through overwhelming experiences is messy. So there will be harm inevitably. And the question is, how do we both set ourselves up and then repair when there's harm? And so what Mia Mingus offers us is there's four main pieces to leading through apology and accountability. One is self-reflection, which we're engaging in right now. One is the art of apology, again, we're studying today, repair, and then behavior change. Darrick will speak a little bit about that later. So I'm going to just offer that. Self-reflection, apologizing, repair, and behavior change. And I'm going to read Mia's offering. I'm going to read Mia's offering, and I'm going to invite you again in the chat box to just name what's coming up for you, what resonates. If we were all together, what would you be highlighting and bolding and starring? And then we'll get to hear from our colleagues. So Mia says, we are aiming for practice, not perfection. We will hurt and misunderstand and harm each other. We are human, and we live in an incredibly violent and harmful world. And the point is to learn how to be accountable when we inevitably mess up so that we know what to do. For me, that last sentence is what usually gets me. That usually gets me because, listen, the permission to inevitably mess up is real, but also the twin ask of then behavior change is also real, right? So it's not just saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It's saying, I'm sorry, and I commit to. Okay, so I'm going to see some of you are loving this. Some of you are loving this. So what's coming up? What's coming up? And Darrick, I'm going to cue you to come on video because we're going to transition to you in a second. Okay, so Natalie is saying being prepared for when we mess up. So let's get a couple more. What's resonating for you? We are aiming for practice, not perfection. We will hurt, misunderstand, and harm. We are human and we live in an incredibly violent and harmful world. And the point is to learn how to be accountable when we inevitably mess up so that we know what to do. What's coming up for you? Yeah, in it together for sure. Yes, we are in it together for sure. Thank you for that. Okay. So there's a lot. Yes, Mark is saying having accountability partners, which hopefully Mark and Claudia will talk about in a second. Oh, I love that. Accept your own humanity, and that the aim for respectiveness, even amidst the messiness. Aim for respectfulness, even amidst the messiness. Beautiful. Okay, a couple more. The we will, it is guaranteed that there's work to be done and must be done in relationship, acknowledging that harm is inevitable and repairable. Gorgeous. These are so gorgeous. Thank you. Okay, colleagues, we're going to transition right now to Dr. Darrick Smith. Darrick is going to let us know what brings him to the conversation. And my setup, not only for Darrick, but also for Mark and Claudia, and also for Rob, is for you to just be listening in with what do you agree, with what might you argue, and with what do you aspire to. So those kind of 3 A's, right? And please do feel free to put your reflections in the chat box as Darrick is sharing. Darrick is going to set us up so that we can be even deeper in our understanding of the art of apology and accountability and repair, with the 3rd A of awareness. Darrick, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see everyone that I can see. I can't think of how many of you are actually on here because that would be too intimidating, but I will say thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. So, my work goes back to some years of youth development and then teaching in the classroom in Oakland, California, and then later on becoming a school principal and working with the California community colleges, and now training school principals at the University of San Francisco and other student affairs professionals in higher ed that I also get a chance to train, and then working directly with school districts and school sites every year currently as a consultant on school climate, discipline, and safety. And so I guess what we'll be talking about in these kind of 3 areas listed as approachability, accountability, and awareness. I'll kind of be discussing them backwards though, kind of awareness and then this accountability and this kind of overall notion of what it means or the importance of having a culture in which folks feel like, crisis can be prevented and that they can work with adults and speak with adults and move through a systematized culture in which a crisis may or may not be necessary in terms of students having particular clashes with each other, or that they can be preventable by folks giving information to adults a lot earlier. Next slide, please. So Those are actually pictures of me. We don't need to see that, but we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So these are kind of the areas that we want to be thinking about in terms of kind of formulating our idea of what needs to happen regarding our role in beginning a process of even healing, even examining a crisis. There becomes this question of whether or not we actually need to apologize. Now, I don't mean to sound like I'm anti-apology. If anyone who knows me, I'm a loving Sagittarius, and I always love to apologize when I've made a mistake. I think it makes people feel like I have some level of competence and confidence, and that I'm not or likely to harm them or insult them in the same way in the future. However, we do want to maintain a level of authenticity as educators in particular, or social service workers, because we want folks to feel that we actually see them as human beings and have some level of understanding around how a particular crisis may have impacted them or how serious it may be. And that requires a level of authenticity, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, okay? So we wanna be thinking about actually what happened. We wanna figure out where might the school actually be better in terms of proactive intervention and prevention, and where might the school be responsible and accountable in thinking in terms of, is there a possible time where our school or organization or agency has possibly been negligent in a way that has led to a crisis occurring. Next slide. One of the reasons why I bring up these things is from my past experience, crisis can happen in all types of ways, right? We can have a student of our own do something to someone in our building or at our site, which causes a pretty serious predicament. We can have our clients or students that are harmed off campus by each other. We can have people that are harmed off campus by folks that are not in our particular organizational community. Then we can have things that are somewhat disconnected, but not completely, that happen between members in the community or things outside of even our community, maybe statewide or nationally, that has a psychological, emotional, financial, and possibly even physical impact on the folks in our building. And it's all these different layers we want to be able to figure out, what is our role in atonement for that? Or is our role something different in terms of creating an environment where folks begin to process and move forward, and begin to address some of the ramifications of the crisis, even though we did not play a role in causing it. Okay, so when we look at these kind of four aspects of trying to evaluate like what actually happened, we want to start, of course, by trying to figure out what were some of the nuances of what occurred. When we investigate or research the incident and the person or persons involved, particularly if it's something close to us or in our building or site. We want to actually get as much detail as we can around what happened, what led up to it, et cetera. We also want to consider the community perspectives and insights. Once we begin to understand who or what actually happened and how it happened, we want to start figuring out how folks in our community, school, or just outside the school, parents even, how folks might start to perceive that. That could vary from one location to another. It could vary from one region to another, depending on who's involved and what happened. And then we want to actually have this understanding of bringing people together. Now, this is not a large community forum, but we want to get, and I'm thinking about as individual leaders or perhaps directors of wellness centers or whatever, we want to then start to build a kind of brain trust of folks really quickly. I might be able to do it with my leadership team. Folks might be able to do it with their, their three immediate, counselors that they supervise, whatever it may be, to start getting other ideas, gathering more info, getting other perspectives on kind of what happened, how people are perceiving it, okay? And then, of course, attune. We want to keep in mind how the school and its various subgroups, the parents, students' identity groups, et cetera, are potentially impacted by what has occurred. Now, we want to remember too that when folks are thinking, when folks are reacting to a crisis, they have to be preoccupied naturally with what they're going to do next, how they're feeling, you know. But our responsibility as educators and folks that are responsible for large swaths of people, large groups of people, we want to start to put in perspective how different interest groups or different potential parts of our communities might be impacted. For example, when there's been like a major incident, perhaps an assault of some sort that was targeting a particular group of individuals, we want to think about those individuals that were targeted. We want to think about folks that maybe have similar characteristics to them. We want to think about folks that may be completely removed or asimilar from those particular identities, and whether or not they feel distanced or unaffected. We want to be thinking about all of that as we begin to consider what our response might be. Next slide, please. I'll go quicker here. And so these are some of the questions that we want to be asking to kind of get an understanding of whether or not we need to give an apology, or if there needs to be, you know, actions that may not include an apology, right? We want to be asking a question: did the harm involve a student, staff, or faculty member? Okay, I've worked with schools in which it was a staff person, an adult member that had been doing something or did something, and it spread like wildfire, and there are employees. So, I mean, you know, they're an employee of the school and the school district. So what happens then? Okay, what, if anything, could the school have done differently? That's a very important question. If whether it's an organization or a school site, you have to think, is there something that we could have done differently? How are your school community members positioned, okay, within the crisis? Victims and or assailants and or witnesses, bystanders. We want to be thinking about that and the nuances of that. You know, what does it mean that you had, you know, maybe students doing something and maybe adults were present but didn't intervene? You know, it's something. Could your staff or faculty have intervened to prevent the incident, which was my point? And then were any campus, district, or state policies neglected or misused in a way that may have contributed to the incident? Unfortunately, many organizations and educational institutions are not aware of their own policies, the district policies, and most likely the state policies under which they're supposed to be operating. And sometimes we can get in a habitus of not functioning underneath those guidelines, which then can lead to particular problems of just kind of basic levels of function that would help us be safer, and then we become negligent. And then were there any early indications that the school personnel could have identified? And which this makes this really important, because schools in some of our nonprofits are some of the only places in which young people in particular will be surrounded by 20 or more adults. In some places, it's 150 to 200 adults are there all day, and every space they're in, they're supposed to be supervised by an adult. So we want to be thinking about, are there things that we could have or should have been picking up on? And as we look through these things, we start to find spaces to where we can be or need to be apologetic, right? Next slide, please. Okay, and I'll move through these quickly. So this is all to clarify where you are responsible and for what you should be held accountable for, okay? And an apology can be, for sure, I've made them myself, be very useful when responsibilities have been neglected and the oversight of students and adults has fallen short. Okay, we want to be considerate of liability issues as well, because sometimes we get nervous, particularly in leadership, about apologizing when it could bring up legal ramifications. Okay, and I'll say that as I'm closing in a few minutes here, 2 minutes. And whether or not we apologize, acknowledging pain and the need for safety is often needed either way. Okay. And part of such acknowledgement, which is key, is the development, presentation, and then implementation of strategies to increase trust and safety at your site or on campus. So even if we don't have an apology to give, which oftentimes we can and should, we also want to add a plan of how we're actually going to get better. And we want to be able to develop that plan, present that plan to our community members, that's students, staff, parents, whoever it may be, all of them, and then begin an implementation process, okay? And in closing, some additional thoughts to consider, right? So, sorry, next slide. Thank you. You got it. You got it. Thank you. So in building the school climate of trust and safety, these are the daily practices that we have to establish clear, fair, and humanizing boundaries and expectations. Okay, clear, fair. We have to do that every day, right? Because what we end up doing sometimes, I'm not saying you, but we as a field of service providers, is that we are in discussions about how to repair things and how to apologize. But sometimes we become so preoccupied with learning how to fix something that we are actually less preoccupied with prevention. And we actually want to be preoccupied with creating a culture and a climate and systems that are consistent and fair and trustworthy, to where we can build up a situation to where we're getting the information that we need, so that when it comes down to crisis happening, there is a lot of trust there, and our abilities to communicate with our communities is embraced, and our authenticity is believed when we're speaking about our remorse or the plans we have on moving forward. Okay, and I think I'm out of time. So I would just,
You're so good. Take a breath. Take a breath. You're
yeah,
good.
I'll take a breath. Can I say these last three, Leora? So really quickly, authentic leadership, you can look it up. Bruce Avolio is really good to look up, but it really has to do with being clear in your ethics and who you are as you do your work, okay? These last two, limitations of the school and the power of the school. We want to remember that the school has a whole job of educating children. And so our ability to transform how an entire broader community feels about a crisis can be very limited. But conversely, the power of the school is that we have young minds that we are there to develop every day for 180 plus days a year. And we have the ability to shape how folks view themselves, other people, and how they learn how to cope with crisis, and how they learn how to establish and maintain healthy and safe environments. So we have a lot of opportunity to make inroads with students and staff and parents as we apologize, as we create environments that are safe. And we want to actually stay focused on that and use that power to improve the community in the long term.
A word. Darrick, thank you, Darrick, so much. I'm going to offer, that was so rich and so dynamic. And I just wanted to offer, as Claudia and Mark come onto video, I wanted to offer you a moment, because we're going to transition right now to a kind of different feeling, where Claudia and Mark are going to be in conversation with each other as two leaders who led in the school community together. I want to offer a moment for you in the chat box to put just one takeaway, one thing that buzzed during Darrick's offering to you. It could have been a sentence, it could have been a concept, it could have been a question. One takeaway from what Darrick just offered, just to help us codify some of our learning. And then I'll introduce Claudia and Mark. One takeaway. Yeah, okay. Authentic leadership, humanizing, authenticity, importance of authenticity. Yep. I really appreciate the distinction between the self-reflection of the need to apologize versus, and also the need to acknowledge. How do we balance both of those at the same time? Yeah, thank you. Just get a couple more. One takeaway. The power of school. Yes, yes. What a wonderful way to end that segment, right? The power of school. Yep, found myself thinking about the Parkland shooting and how people laid a lot of blame on the SRO type staffer who froze. But just kind of like, so there's some stories that are conjuring right now. And so much of us, and particularly because we know that renewal, school crisis renewal, is about developing a coherent narrative, right? Moving from chaos to cohesion and the story of ourselves, because we know that the biggest act of trauma is to freeze and to chaotically scramble the story of who we are as individuals and as the collective. that oftentimes apology can be putting back, or repair or accountability can be putting those coherent narrative pieces back together. So some of you are remembering stories of how we as a culture or community were experiencing fracture in a moment of crisis. Yeah. All right, last a couple more. Learning when not to apologize can be prevention as well. Acknowledgement of pain and the need for safety. Beautiful. Okay. Without further ado, I'm going to pass us on to Mark and Claudia, who will introduce themselves. And Mark and Claudia are going to be in dialogue with one another. So I'm going to move us to they created beautiful walkaways. What an you know when you're bringing on educators when they codify walkaways. So I'm going to bring up their walkaways, but I really encourage you, if you can, to widen your screen so that you aren't just looking at the words, or if you only want to look at the words and then want to listen into them, any way that the screen can help you regulate. But they're going to be in conversation with each other. And then you'll see me come back on when it's time to transition. Thanks so much, Claudia and Mark.
Thanks, Leora.
Thank you, querida Leora.
How
So
you doing?
I'll introduce myself first, if that's okay, Mark.
Absolutely.
Hi, everybody. My name is Claudia Rojas. I have been an educator for 18 years. I've served as a teacher, as a principal, and now as a coach. And I'm so happy to be here today with some of who I consider my squad members. And what's bringing us here today is the fact that we worked together at a school that experienced and continues to experience many crises, especially loss. And Mark is one of my accountability partners. So it's nice to be in this conversation with you this morning, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, I come with about the same amount of years in education in various forms. Currently, history curriculum specialist for my district in Central California. But I think the role of intervention coordinator in the last 2 years of our really wonderful and challenging 5-year journey together in opening these high schools in Los Angeles is what brings us into this conversation as a launching pad, right?
Yes.
So I guess the first question is, as the founding school leader of one of our small high schools on our campus, how did you go about creating a climate of trust and safety and transparency and repair after student deaths and other big events that we dealt with that we considered crisis?
Sure. So I found that I was very lucky because I walked into an environment that had all of those elements in place, and I felt that my biggest role was to maintain that and to continue it. So there was a design team made up of mainly teachers, community members who came together to write plans for the schools that we eventually opened. And in reading those plans and really dissecting them, I found that the core values of the schools resonated with who I was already. This was my first experience as an administrator, period, as a principal ever. And the only thing that I really knew that I had to do, that I could do, is to lead with love and authenticity. And it was actually like wonderful because I came in so naive and I could just do that without really having to worry about what people thought of that or what that meant. A lot of times when you are an administrator, you're told to act a certain way or be a certain way. And I was just myself. And so I worked really hard on establishing relationships with staff, families, students, and did all of the prep work I think that was needed and that came into play once we began to experience different crises. Another thing that really helped, I think, at our school is that after our first year, which was the hardest year of my life in general because of everything that came with opening a new school, opening it in the community that we did, which was plagued with violence and poverty and, everything that you could think of that would affect a student's success, we learned a lot, and we figured out that the way that we were dealing with our students who needed our help and our support was not the right way. And so we turned to restorative justice practices, and we wrote a grant. We got funding to be able to hire a full-time coordinator who then trained all of us. And as a collective staff, we began to implement strategies, in particular community building circles with our students that eventually helped us have harm and healing circles, and that eventually helped us to deal with loss. And so whenever a crisis would happen, one of the things that we would do immediately, we had a team who would come together and develop circle lessons, right? That every teacher was expected to teach, right? When that crisis would happen. Of course, having the support that they needed if they were particularly impacted by that crisis. So I think all of those uh, things that I spoke of really helped to cultivate that climate of trust and transparency that is so critical during those difficult times.
Yeah, and hearing you reflect on those years together, it reminded me of the very first moment when we met, and just connecting it to Dr. Smith's point, the both the power and the limitations of the school, right, in situated within a community, and then just the role of community and the power of defining that collectively. I remember we had you had come into a living room of one of our design team members and had been introduced to the design team, and hearing you speak, I could see that the authenticity of you putting yourself out there just as who you were, and then that didn't change once you became one of the principals, even though there was a risk and we were actually dissuaded in many ways to not hire an inexperienced administrator to open up school in such a challenging community. But it was that authenticity, I think, that in my opinion, was a kind of a no-brainer. Like, of course, we want her to be a leader, because she bringing your whole humanity to the situation. And then reflecting on just the role that restorative practices have played in getting us up to a level where we could respond to so many crises, as well as we did, knowing that we probably would have all loved maybe less, but also we could maybe see instances of improvement. But I shudder to think of how we would have responded or not been able to respond if we hadn't had cultivated a practice of community building through circles, and then and also building the capacity for everyone in the school community to be able to engage in healing and harm circles as well. I want to ask you, kind of narrowing it down in terms of this concept of apology. How as a school leader have you learned to model apology, or when did you utilize the art of apology in your practice?
Yeah, so I actually thought about a student as I was listening to Darrick speak, and I was reading some of the comments in the chat. And, it's interesting how our brains work. In preparation, I hadn't thought about this, but I want to speak to it because she came to me and I want to honor her. So she was a student who everyone on campus knew, adults and students. She was wonderful and she was complicated and just had this energy about her where, again, everybody knew her. And one of the hardest crises that we experienced was when one of our students was shot and killed in the community right after school, when our students were dismissing about a block away from our school site. And the student who passed was one of her best friends, and she was there when it happened. And so, of course, as we began to respond, we did everything in our power to to respond in the best way that we could. We checked off all the boxes that we were supposed to in terms of just kind of the protocol. Um, and I remember so clearly, I think it was like 2 days after, um, we start hearing on the radios, like, oh, there's something going on with the student, and happened to be my student. And so, I come out to the quad area and I see her, and she's wailing, like screaming her anguish and her pain. And there's just people around. You could see people peeking from the windows, because we had like 4 stories at our school, and just like everybody's like focused on what the student is doing. And then I feel like everyone's looking at me like, what are you gonna do, Claudia, right now in this moment? And I want to acknowledge Deb Thomas in the chat. You said that a lot of times we have to let go of our anger and our fear and just apologize. And that's all I could think of doing at that time, is just, I was angry that like there was this scene that was being created and disrupting, kind of the normal instruction or whatever's supposed to be happening. I was fearful because I thought, oh my gosh, what is going to happen if we're not able to help her? And then I thought, at this moment, I just need to sit with her and apologize to her on behalf of everyone who has ever let her down, ever, right? Up until this point in her 16 years of life. And so I approached her, and because again, we had a relationship, I had worked really hard to develop this relationship with her where she trusted me. I was able to approach her and just, pause and place my hand on her shoulder and tell her, it's going to be okay. And right now, I just need you to sit with me so that we can talk. And we sat in the middle of the quad, and I held her in my arms, and I just let her cry. We cried together, and I just told her, I'm sorry for everything that has happened. Um, and after that, people started to go back to where they had come from to see, and we just sat together for a long time until I felt that she was going to be okay. And eventually she went back to her, usual just vibrant self. And um, it required, of course, that we had to continue to check in with her and the others who had been greatly affected by what had happened. But it was a powerful moment. I think for all of us, and as the leader, the lesson that I learned is that oftentimes you just have to take a moment to pause,
Yeah.
and to be human, um, and help. And that's what I continue to do. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I mean, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate you again being vulnerable and going back to these wounds, right? That you and I carry these scars, and one of the things, the tactic of that, I think that there is no more powerful example of an art of an apology that is removed from accountability, right? As you said, like we had done everything that we could in response to the crisis after it happened. I know I was, I hold a lot of grief about my role leading up to the crisis, right? Because it was something that we had anticipated, and I was one of the folks who was doing everything that he could to try to avoid that situation.
Right.
And just having an apology that is not necessarily attached to your own personal accountability, right? I mean, there might have been instances where, as a principal, you had caused harm unintentionally to her in different situations, or you had your disagreements. I remember that. But you weren't apologizing for those. You were, in that moment, you were apologizing for the harm that the world and the systems, put on our students.
For sure.
And so for me, I think, so we have, you also mentioned time and space, right? And I feel like we're even, I don't know, 3 years. You stayed an extra year at the schools to see out your time. I'm not sure I could have had these conversations with any less amount of time, right? So I fall in the plus category of that kind of framework, right? Of renewal.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but what has
None,
been?
but finish.
Oh, okay. I just think that, like, the process of renewal requires community, right? And so, and time and space as well. And the last thing I'll say is, in addition to these walkaways, one of the things that Leora mentioned in terms of making yourself open and vulnerable, I thought of immediately like a camera aperture, right? And widening the lens enough to see what you might have been missing in that moment, that allows you to maybe be more vulnerable and open to healing and renewal. But that can't be done completely alone. So I appreciate you, friend, being here with me in this conversation today.
Likewise, I love you.
Love you too.
Mm, mm, mm. I'm going to invite everyone to take, I know, Claudia, I saw you drinking water, which I'm so grateful for. I'm going to invite everyone to take water and to find a moment of just stillness. And I want to offer in the chat box, not the takeaway or walkways from Claudia and Mark, but actually any appreciation or connection. And you're already getting some, but when one of our colleagues models the deep vulnerability that we talked about at the beginning, it's so powerful to offer ways of, I see you and I hear you and I resonate with you. And so I'm going to offer you, and Claudia and Mark actually have to transition about 2 minutes because, district and the lunch break ends. And we'll continue with Rob, but I really would like to invite us in the panelists and attendees drop down to offer what is one offering to Mark and to Claudia as accountability partners that you'd like to say, I see you, or I hear you, or I resonated with you. Yeah, so we're getting, for Claudia and Mark, we're getting a lot of beautiful, we love the walkways. There's lots of affirmation and affection. We have your ability to love and care for and nurture the student is the most powerful example of leadership. And I'm certain she remembers every moment of that interaction to this day. Powerful. Thank you for the space. Keep your head and your heart in this work, from Mark. Yes, thank you. Okay. If Mark and Claudia transition, which I know they have to, I promise you, and if you would like to have something get to them in the chat box or after, I promise you, we will do that, because it is not only vulnerable to be who we are in the world, but it's also vulnerable to present vulnerability on a webinar. The meta vulnerability. So I'm taking a breath and I'm going to invite Rob to come on. And I just wanted to note, we're this journey that we're in this today in the art of apology and repair. There's been different energy in each chapter, right? Darrick has one energy, Claudia and Mark are offering another, and Rob is offering another. And the reason that we're diversifying each offering or each segment is because all of us come to this conversation with different needs. Some of us may need more here, some of us may need more here, and some of us may need more here. So I'm going to invite Rob to share who he is and what brings him to this Conversation. Rob comes both as an educator and a school psychologist, and Crisis Response, National Association of School Psychologists prepare curriculum, master human person. We're so excited. And I just want to say one thing before Rob, before you come on, which is that some of you might still be in the chapter of Darrick's contribution, and some of you might still be in the chapter of what Claudia and Mark just brought up, and that's okay. That's okay. All of this is about choice, and so you get to choose where and when you want your attention to locate. And I am going to just warmly invite you to open yourselves to Rob's offering. So Rob, welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's quite a transition to start to think about talking after listening, because that was just, really special conversations. And that last conversation, where we're talking about our connection with students and with people around us, it just reminded me there's a paragraph in the dedication of my dissertation to a student that now that I've known for 17 years, and how important, they can become to us when, as leaders in crisis response, we allow ourselves to connect kind of human to human. Sometimes these bonds develop and just show us the power of what happens when hearts connect. So I would just really appreciate you sharing that story, and the emotion behind it with us keeps us invigorated moving forward. So if we can go ahead to my first slide. We'll just talk a little bit about my role. My role in crisis is through the National Association of School Psychologists. I'm also a practicing school psychologist. Despite all of my other roles, I'm a summer school principal and do other things. I have not been able to let go of working with the students on a daily basis on campus. And so I work in a school district on the east side of Los Angeles County, and it's kind of a varied district, so we see a lot of different needs and type of students. So in terms of leadership, my doctorate is in educational leadership with a special focus in school psychology and the practice of crisis response. Our National Association sponsors the Prepare curriculum, which we talked about as one of those frameworks that we use to respond when acute traumatic stressors occur on a campus or in a community. My particular interest then was taking that curriculum and moving it a little further in terms of what animates it. So we know that in our our ethical guidelines, and we know in our practice models that associations put out, like our NASP association, there are often references to leadership and how do we lead, who are we as we lead. And one of the questions I had personally was in our own practice model, when I searched leading, leadership, the need to act as leaders, we found like 20 different references to that word. Out of the 20 different references, there weren't any specific guidelines or behaviors. So what does it mean to actually be a leader? What should I actually do? I'm being encouraged and charged with this role to step forward. But how does that play out? Why are some leaders better or different than others? So that started kind of an exploration, and it turned into a mountain, of course, like anything, of information. And so for today, that I get you for 10 or 15 minutes, kind of where do we start? What do we grab onto out of that mountain? So I have two kind of starting places that I posted for you on this slide. Kevin Cashman wrote a book called Leadership from the Inside Out. And then Kouzes and Posner have developed several different models and books, but one of the kind of hallmark ones is the idea of credibility and being a leader that develops effective communication and builds trust with those that they're engaged with. So those are two places you can start if leadership is something you're curious about, especially leadership in the midst of crisis. And they're something that you can, are easy reads. They're also an audio book that you can listen to as you drive around if you'd like. But Cashman kind of begins the conversation in terms of we lead by virtue of who we are. We develop ourselves to become leaders. And so authenticity is that continual process of building a knowledge base of who we are. What are our strengths and what are our limitations? Leadership, especially during crisis, is going to expose both of those. It's going to expose things we're good at, and it's clearly going to put a magnifying glass over the things that are hard for us. And so the initial process of developing yourself as a leader is that self-reflection, is starting to understand, what am I best at? And taking a deep breath and letting yourself be honest about what your own limitations are. Where do you struggle? And in doing so, you begin to develop a vision of what you would like to be as a leader. So credibility, the Kouzes and Posner book, is built on all of the research, right? So big business has funded the idea of developing leaders because they want to maximize profit. And so schools haven't had the same resources to do these studies and develop these books. So a lot of what we do as educators is borrowed from that industry. But Kouzes and Posner really has shown us that effective leadership is about being a person who is willing to take on that challenge and take on that responsibility. And it's not about title. It's about your own personal ability to lead wherever you are within an organization, within your role. So we look at leadership now as no longer a rank or a privilege. This idea of early leadership theories that were called great man leadership theories or trait leadership had this assumption that some people were stronger, smarter, and better than others. And that was a violent approach to leadership. So we're looking at connection. And where are we within the network of our organization that we can lead, that we can set the example, and that as we aspire to do that, we build trust and connection with others. So if my title is principal, I'm going to do that within this web or network of my organization. If my title is school psychologist or history teacher, or I'm working in a lunchroom, or I'm a custodian taking care of everything that we need on campus, there's a role for you in terms of leadership. If you want to go on to the next slide. I want to give you just a little example kind of built into this idea, and I call it the case of the Xerox machine. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But we know that hierarchical leadership or top-down leadership is violent, right? I assume a position and I direct what I feel is right downward. And so as I do that and I move people in a direction I feel is best, eventually I set myself up as an expert, right? I start to set myself into a position that eventually I will need to defend. So as people question or challenge, if I silo myself and my ideas have to be the top ideas and it's my way or the highway, eventually in words or actions, I'll have to defend that position. And in doing so, I have to put someone else down. And we know that that in turn then damages relationships, right? And it damages our ability to connect to people. So if Claudia had done that with the teachers and with the staff and with the students that were hurting around her, right, we would clearly see damage, and that beautiful connection they had wouldn't have occurred. So we move away from the idea of hierarchical leadership, and in a cycle, we accept that commitment to lead, to listen, and to understand. It's really a relationship, and it's a human process that we participate together. So as I talked about, we move into value clarification. What's important to me? What are our goals as an organization? What are my goals as a person? We understand that relationship. And then as we engage in this process, eventually, like we've talked about, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to say or do something that runs either contrary to the values of our organization, or it runs against what someone else feels is valuable and important. And so I create an injury or I hurt them. And so I have to have the ability to receive that and hear that so that I can repair it. So the case of the Xerox machine was we were responding to a suicide that had occurred on campus. And so there was just trauma from not only what people saw and heard and smelled, but also what they experienced in terms of the reactions from others. And so it was an exceptionally tense place. Law enforcement was present, helicopters were overhead, teachers were upset and crying, understandably, students were in shock. And so we descend into this and we try to make a difference. And one of the things that the school administration wanted to do quickly was to push information out about reactions to trauma, information about suicide, how to get help if you need help. And so they were creating a packet that they were going to put out to all of the staff members. And so they ran this packet through the Xerox machine, and people were moving quickly. They felt like they wanted this out sooner rather than later. And in doing so, no one checked to see, as they dropped the documents into the feeder, that one of the documents went through crooked. And so as it went through crooked, it came out obviously with a slight bend in the packet that they were doing. There wasn't any information cut off. All of the information, the title, everything that was intended to go out to others was present, but it was crooked. And there was an extreme reaction on some of the staff members' part, that they felt very hurt and very insulted. And that people were not demonstrating care surrounding this traumatic situation by doing that, that it showed carelessness, it showed a hurried, kind of less than concerned attitude. And so the administration began to assume the position of defending that. I don't know why they're acting that way. This is silly. We have bigger things to worry about. All of the information is there, so they need to get over it and move on. So if we look at kind of this cycle, though, as a leader, what we needed to do was to stop that process. And so I insert myself in to try to open the discussion about the relationships that were happening and what was going on. Within this particular school, they pride themselves on caring for students, students first, and being able to connect in a very positive way and doing the best you can do every day for kids. And so that particular form going through the Xerox machine began to represent a problem and a conflict between the response to the crisis, the administration, and really fundamental values of the teachers in the school. So an injury had occurred. So instead of defending our position as what we were giving you what you need, I don't understand, you guys are hurt, that's why you're overreacting, we got out of that and we clarified our own values, that we want the same things the school wants, that the mission of the school endorses, and that the teachers live and breathe every day. And so we had to go back and we had to acknowledge that. And in doing that, we had to remember the leaders are not giving away their expertise and their talents and all of the gifts that they bring to the table. They're simply going back and rebuilding the relationships so that we can continue forward to do the work that we're really called to do, which is to stop the trauma, the impact of the trauma, which is to identify the students that are in greatest need and to begin to offer care and rebuilding and hope and moving forward through that process. And so doing that, we needed to go back and we needed to acknowledge it and say, we apologize for that. We should have taken some more care so that our behaviors aligned with the values as leaders and as an organization. And that process was difficult for some people. So that process of kind of self-reflection as you enter that leadership role is so critical, so that when you find yourself in these unexpected moments, no one could ever have predicted that a slightly crooked copy in a packet of 15 pages going out to a staff would ever have elicited that. So it's not something we practice, but knowing who we are before we find ourselves in that moment, and knowing that the relationship is more important than anything, and is clearly a move away from that hierarchical, antiquated thinking that does damage, is something that helps us really be our best as leaders in the moments of crisis. And going through the process of listening, understanding, and repairing strengthens us. Apology doesn't weaken us. And for some people, until they examine that, they feel that offering an apology is an admission of weakness. And in fact, it's entirely the opposite. It's a move away from violent behavior and violent communication. So hopefully that gets you started on that mountain. I hope that's something that's important to you. You know, it's something that becomes more of a calling than a title or a position or a role. And so today, hopefully I'm able to encourage you a little bit further down that path.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate your care with connecting all the different strands of this conversational necklace and also helping us bring a real life example of, and again, really bringing, because that real life example showcases the messiness of the match between intention and impact, and then how we repair when intention and impact are misaligned. And so just grateful for that reflection. And I'm going to invite us. So we're moving into tying all the threads together. So you just heard me take a breath. I invite you to take yours. And I'm going to invite you to just take a moment to think about just what's sitting with you. There's been a lot of food offered on the table. What's sitting with you? And I encourage you, when it comes to you, to offer it in our chat box table as a conversational potluck. But what's sitting with you? So we started today talking about transformational justice's connection with the art of apology and repair and vulnerability. We talked about the school mental health leadership definition of preparing for uncertainty and inevitability. Darrick helped us with awareness, accountability, and acknowledgement, and the difference between the three. Claudia and Mark, as accountability partners, modeled what actual renewal conversation can look like years later, and also how we as educators often are the cathartic acknowledgement and apology for many of the young people that we love and serve, who may not get that, and the folks that may not get that. And then Rob offering us that relational leadership is at the foundation, right? It's the primer and it's the salve. So we're getting that what's sitting with you is the need to slow down. We've got radical empathy. I'd be curious who put radical empathy, if you might want to give us one more sentence about what's the difference between radical empathy and empathy. And we've got leadership trainings, especially for school leaders, should include practical workshops on relational leadership. That's right. So it's both an approach and also a skill, a muscle that we need to continue to hone. We need to continue to hone. I continue to hone. That apology is not a sign of weakness, and celebration of, I'm going to take away the word celebration because that wasn't offered, but the be human, the acknowledging humanity. Yeah. Empathy at all stages, empathy in a forward approach. Thank you. Yeah. Forgiveness of ourselves as well. Yeah. So I'm going to read another contribution. Thank you so much. As a line staff member, how important it is to witness vulnerability and accountability by admin leadership, to be able to see leaders pause and be human, to be safe enough to trust. Compassionate approach to leadership, and leadership as empowerment rather than control, right? The biggest part of this whole trauma-informed thing that we're all committed to, the healing-centered thing that we're all committed to, is moving from a power over, which many of us have been schooled in all the ways, to a power with. Yeah. So I want to acknowledge a question that came up in the chat box earlier, which was about how do we get folks who aren't ready to be vulnerable, who aren't interested necessarily in leading, who may have hesitancy and may not see that as a part of their crisis leadership. How do we invite folks in? And the piece that I wanted to offer, and I do invite Darrick and Rob if you had other thoughts about this, and I also, of course, want to offer you to put some questions that you might have in the chat box so we have a little bit of time for dialogue. The piece I wanted to offer, and this is my own learning as a school mental health leader and as an observer of so many of you, both at school, district, county, and state leadership, systems leadership that are leading people through really big hurt, that so often there is a demand or a need for the folks who are in leadership to show and to embody the values and the principles that we've been talking about today. The piece that's really tricky is that you can't force someone into vulnerability, because that's not power with, that's still power over. The other piece that's really tricky is that vulnerability shows up in really different ways, depending on our own ability to arrive, our own readiness to arrive. So if someone is not necessarily in the space yet to lead relationally or to lead through a lens of vulnerability, as Claudia modeled and Mark modeled and Darrick has modeled and Rob certainly does. It doesn't mean that they're anything less or wrong or bad. It may mean that there hasn't been a sense of safety. If we go back to the trauma-informed principles, a sense of safety in their lives in all the ways for them to show up in that way. So it's a question for us to sit in, right? How do we as school community members continue to cultivate a sense of safety for us, so that the way that I need to experience vulnerability or see vulnerability, because it helps me be more courageous, might be different for someone else. So just like safety is contextualized, so is vulnerability, right? So I just wanted to offer that. I know that, and so I'm just going to see if there's any other questions in the chat box. Questions in the chat box for both Darrick or Rob, myself, or our team, or for each other that's coming up. Questions in the chat box. So as you're kind of landing and tying it all together, I just wanted to offer a couple takeaways or walkaways. Actually, I really love that Mark and Claudia say walk away because it's such a power with versus power over. Take this versus walk with me with this. So a couple walkaways, in addition to all the content that Darrick and Mark and Claudia and Rob offered. One is to sit with the question, what is your relationship with honesty and transparency at work? It's just like one generative inquiry question. What's your relationship with honesty and transparency at work? Knowing that safety is the foundational trauma-informed principle. Another question is like, what does transparency feel like to you? What does it look like or sound like or feel like? And how do you know when someone is being transparent? How do you know when you're being transparent? How do you know when you're being trustworthy? So some fodder. And I wanted to end on another Mia Mingus quote, and then we'll get into some next steps. I wanted to end on another Mia Mingus quote, and Mia Mingus says, accountability is generative and not punitive. So in all of this work around the art of apology and repair with school leadership, we aren't looking to blame, we're not looking to shame, and we're not looking to punish. Right? That's a really, if accountability is generative, that means what comes out of it. That's reparative, relationship-centered, and will actually create new ways of being that hadn't been before the harm. Generative. If you want punishment, you should be upfront and transparent about that. So sometimes we say, I need you to apologize, or I want you to be accountable. But really what we're needing is to see someone be punished. That's a different truth. That's a question about our own transparency when we're demanding or when we're asking, right? She invites us to not ask for accountability when we really want is punishment or revenge. And I'm actually saying that very explicitly for school communities where there's a lot, we've been taught to be fractioned rather than interactive and connected and interdependent. And this is the last piece that we're going to close on, which is just as it takes work to be accountable, it also takes work to receive someone's accountability. So we're committed at SCRR to really, if when you fill out your evaluation form, shameless plug, when you fill out your evaluation form, if this is a conversation, just like I think one of us said, we need more time with these skills. I know personally that I want to constantly be learning about not only how to be held accountable, how to be accountable, but also how to receive someone's accountability. It's a different practice. So what might that look like? And the question for all of us, right? This is me stepping in. If we were in a room together, I would say, when in the past have you received someone's accountability? And what made it possible for that to happen? And what did it feel like to incorporate someone's accountability into your experience of relationship with them? That might be a student or a community member or a district leader or yourself. Okay. The last piece, if you're with us, you know that we do this at the end of every session before we close. Last piece, I'm going to invite you to just take one moment. We've been doing this throughout, but now that we're kind of pausing, semicolon, moving ahead. Now that we are moving forward, just to take one moment to offer, and I'm going to invite Darrick and Rob to do this for themselves as well. It can be one takeaway or walk away, one thing you want everyone to know, or a question or curiosity or wondering. And then the other invitation, if those two are not feeling accessible right now, what's one appreciation of yourself to what you're feeling and doing? It could be like, I listened, I engaged in this whole conversation, even though it was really challenging at some moments, right? Or I didn't, or I walked away when it was challenging. I took care of myself and I came back. So I'm just gonna offer one curiosity, appreciation, or one thing that you want folks to know. Okay, so I'm going to read out, if you're writing to just panelists, folks won't be able to see it, so I'm going to help read them out. So the one, maybe a takeaway is, we are a process. We are a process. That's right. That's why it's called The Art of Apology and Repair. We are a process, not the guidebook to apology and repair. Honesty and accountability is a priority for you. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Building relationships with team members, schools, and community entities, right? So the building relationships is the soil, so that when harm happens, which is inevitable, that there's a relationship to hold and figure out that harm in the context of people being willing to be more vulnerable and protected and seen they are made to feel. No, I'm gonna read that one more time. That was not right. People will be willing to be more vulnerable the more protected and seen they are made to feel. That's the right read. Thank you, Darrick. People will be willing to be more vulnerable the more protected and seen they are made to feel. Yes. Okay. All right, last but not least, that life is a journey and the art of apology and repair is also a journey. To be honest is to be vulnerable. My wish is for schools to grow and to become places of true safety for both staff and students. Absolutely, us too. Okay. And some of you are sitting with the wondering, where has vulnerability showed up in ways I have not recognized in myself or in others? Okay, lovely. Okay, well, speaking of vulnerability, we've got a couple, the art of apology and atonement and repair, we've got a couple opportunities for us to sit in this a little bit more. One is that I just want to put that we've collected a lot of good literature on trust and repair in school culture. So if you're someone who needs to intellectualize your experience, there are so many resources for you to do so here. And they're at the end of the deck when you download the PDF. The other piece is that I just want to remind us that at our last session in the renewal module, we had a session to go through the 7 school crisis renewal leadership elements. So if you're interested in going back to that, or another session, Darrick was on a recovery session with us. I know Livia's put the link to the other foundational modules in the chat, but everything's recorded and accessible. And we're working on translating all the foundational modules to a curriculum that we can use in our pre or post-service programs. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. You may have gotten, you should have hopefully gotten this in our newsletter. We are so excited for a new opportunity called the COVID Crisis Recovery and Renewal Coaching Consulting Communities, because we all need so many C's in our lives. Our colleagues Oriana Iles and Antoine Moore are going to be leading school communities. It can be a group, I think the max is a group of 8 from across the country, 3 through 4 sessions around trauma-informed healing-centered leadership in both for school communities who have already gone through a big thing and are now responding to COVID. So please, 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 please check out the website below. Livia just put it in the chat box is what I wanted to say. and we interest form by February 1st if you want to participate. So all the information, who it is, what it is, why it is at the bottom of the screen. That website, we can send it to you again. We'll send it in the follow-up. We'll send it all the ways. And you can also get it on our website. And then, of course, next week, we've got another session on psychosocial supports for students during pandemic response. And then if you would like to talk out loud with people to debrief today's session, tomorrow's session, please join us on the 28th for our coaching clinic so we can be in peer support. All right, last but not least, if you got a TA request, presentation, workshop, need a resource, let us know. We're here for you. And then, of course, you can always contact us here. I want to close us with really inviting you to fill out an evaluation. It takes about 5 minutes. It helps us know where we need to grow and what programs we want in the future. While I'm doing this and while Livia puts Livia's on it, while Livia puts the link in the chat box, I want to do an enormous, enormous gratitude. Enormous gratitude. I hope you all join me in the chat box to Dr. Darrick Smith, to Claudia and Mark, to Dr. Rob Coad, for generously offering your wisdom, your vulnerability, your reflections, and your learning. And I want to really thank all of you. The offerings that you put in the chat box were enormous teachings and text. So we'll work on also codifying them anonymously, of course, so that we can continue the learning. On behalf of the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal program, I am just so grateful to be in community with all of you. My name is Leora, Project Director. I hope that you continue to join us and get involved with us so that we can grow this community and grow our leadership and our repair and our commitment to school crisis, healing, justice, all the good stuff together. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon. Thank you, everyone.